Okay, let's unpack this number. $275 trillion.
Yeah.
That's the estimate, right?
Yeah.
The global investment needed by 2050 to hit net zero.
It's a staggering figure when you first hear it.
It really is. But, instead of just letting that number overwhelm you, think about this. It's roughly half of all global corporate profits from, 2020.
That's right.
Yeah.
And framing it that way really drives home that this isn't just an expense line item. It's a fundamental reshaping of the whole economic system.
Exactly. A massive transformation.
And what the McKinsey Global Institute report really highlights, the one called the net zero transition, what it would cost, what it could bring, is that this isn't just about, dodging the worst of climate change.
Right.
It's about these huge economic and societal shifts that are coming, whether we're fully ready or not.
And this isn't some guess either. It's McKinsey Global Institute. They worked with their sustainability folks, their energy experts.
Yes, people like Mikala Krishnan, Hamid Samandari, Jonathan Voedsel, Sven Smith, serious analysis behind it.
So our job here in this deep dive is really to pull out the core stuff for you. Why does it matter? What might, maybe, surprise you?
Keep it clear, focused.
Exactly. Clarity, not just drowning in data. So you walk away feeling like, okay, I get the big picture now.
Right.
Yeah.
So that headline number, $275 trillion.
Yeah.
Let's break that down a bit. What is that, actually?
Yeah, where does it go? It sounds like just throwing money at the sky.
Well, it's projected capital spending. So tangible things, physical assets for energy systems, for land use systems, between 2021 and 2050. That's the time frame.
Okay, physical assets, infrastructure.
Exactly. And if you average it out, it's about $9.2 trillion a year.
9.2 trillion annually.
Yeah.
Still hard to grasp. Any other ways to think about that scale?
Okay, try this. The increase in spending needed each year, that's up to maybe $3.5 trillion more than we spend. Now that increase alone is like, half of global corporate profits in 2020.
Wow.
Or think of it as a quarter of all global tax revenues that year.
A quarter of all taxes.
Yeah. Or about 7% of what every household globally spent. It's a major, major redirection of capital.
That puts it in perspective. And the report also said, didn't it, that about $1 trillion of what we already spend needs to shift.
Precisely. About $1 trillion a year that's currently going into higher emission assets needs to be redirected towards low emission ones.
So not all new money, some is reallocation.
Correct. And look, the spending is front-loaded. It's expected to peak, maybe hit almost 9% of global GDP, somewhere between 2026 and 2030.
Okay, so a big push early on.
Yes, which sounds daunting. But crucially, many of these investments aren't just costs sunk into the ground. They actually have positive return profiles.
Beyond just avoiding climate disaster, you mean?
Exactly. Economic returns. And plus, there's the whole technology piece. Innovation could bring these costs down faster than we currently think.
Right, the tech keeps getting better and cheaper, hopefully.
That's the potential upside on the cost side. Now, let's maybe pivot to how all this investment, how it reshapes the economy and, the job market.
Yeah, this is where it gets really tangible for people. Livelihoods, industries changing.
Totally. So sectors that rely heavily on high emissions, and that's still about 20% of the global economy. Remember, they're facing huge changes. Demand shifts, cost pressures, job.
Like fossil fuels, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The report uses a specific scenario, the NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenario,
Yeah.
just a reference point for what could happen. And in that scenario, coal for energy, almost gone by 2050.
Wow. Nearly phased out.
And oil and gas production,
Yeah.
significantly lower. We're talking drops of maybe 55% for oil, 70% for gas compared to today.
It's huge declines, and that ripples through, right, to manufacturing, heavy industry.
Exactly. You'll likely see production costs go up in some areas because they need to decarbonize their processes. Steel, for example, maybe up around 30%. Cement, maybe 45% higher costs by 2050.
Okay, so costs up in some traditional sectors.
And this is the other side, the markets for low carbon stuff.
Yeah.
They're set to boom. Electricity demand, for instance, could easily more than double by 2050 as we electrify transport, heating, everything.
So a massive growth area, new markets opening up.
Huge new markets. Which brings us back to jobs. It's a major reallocation.
Okay, the numbers. What are we looking at?
Well, potential losses first. The report estimates around 9 million direct jobs could be lost in fossil fuel extraction and production operations, maintenance,
9 million.
and maybe another 4 million in traditional fossil fuel power plants.
Okay, that's significant displacement.
It is. And agriculture sees shifts too. Maybe 34 million fewer jobs linked mostly to livestock.
34 million. Wow.
Yeah, mainly livestock farming. But potentially offset somewhat by gains elsewhere in agriculture, like maybe 12 million jobs in areas like poultry production.
Okay, so some churn within agriculture too. But
Uh-huh.
what about the gains? The clean energy jobs?
Right, the creation side. Building out all the new clean power infrastructure, solar farms, wind turbines,
Hmm.
grids that could create up to 27 million direct jobs, especially in the earlier years.
27 million. Okay.
And by 2050, you could see another 16 million direct jobs just in the manufacturing and construction needed to support all these low-emission technologies.
So if you add it all up, net job growth seems possible. But the key thing is where those jobs are, right?
Exactly. That's the critical point. These losses and gains are concentrated. They're in specific sectors, specific regions.
Like the U.S. Cole County example in the report.
Precisely. Communities heavily reliant on, say, coal mining face enormous challenges. They'll need real support. Reskilling, economic diversification,
Yeah.
it's not automatic.
Okay. Big shifts for industries, big shifts for workers.
Yeah.
What about us, consumers? How does this hit our wallets, our daily lives?
Yeah, really important piece. It's going to touch everyone. Initially, consumers might face higher upfront costs for some things.
Like what?
Think electric vehicles. Or maybe installing a heat pump instead of a gas furnace. Those initial purchase prices can be higher right now.
Okay. And energy bills.
There's definitely a possibility of higher electricity costs, at least in the near term, if the grid upgrades and new generation costs get passed through.
Hmm.
And that risk, unfortunately, tends to hit lower-income households hardest. They spend a bigger chunk of their income on energy.
Right. So potentially higher costs up front for certain goods, maybe higher energy bills for a while.
It's possible. And we might also see our spending habits change, moving away from fossil fuel-intensive stuff, maybe even dietary shifts, like eating less beef or lamb, which have, a bigger carbon footprint.
Okay, so potential cost pressures. But is there a flip side? Do we save money anywhere in the long run?
Yes, absolutely. The report makes that clear. Lower operating costs over time are a key benefit.
Ah, okay. Like with the EVs.
Exactly. The total cost of ownership for an EV, buying it, fueling it, maintaining it, that's expected to be lower than a gasoline car in most places pretty soon, like by 2025 in many cases.
Okay, so cheaper to run, eventually making up for the purchase price.
Potentially, yes. And if those dietary shifts happen, moving to less emissions-intensive foods could potentially lead to lower food costs too, depending on how agriculture adapts.
Interesting. Lower running costs over time. Now, another term that pops up is asset stranding. Sounds bad. What is that exactly?
It refers to existing assets, power plants, pipelines, factories that basically become unusable or uneconomic before the end of their expected lifespan because of the transition. They get stranded.
So investments that don't pay off.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Particularly in the fossil fuel sector. The report talks about potentially trillions of dollars in capital stock tied up in assets that could be stranded.
Trillions. That's a huge financial risk.
It is. Just in the power sector alone, the estimate is maybe $2.1 trillion worth of assets could be stranded by 2050.
2.1 trillion.
And a lot of that is relatively new coal plants, especially in places like China and India. Plants built with the expectation of running for decades more.
Wow, so brand new infrastructure that might have to shut down early. That's got major implications for investors, for stability.
Huge implications. It really underscores why a planned, orderly transition is so important to try and manage that risk rather than have a chaotic write-down.
Makes sense. Okay, the report also mentions this idea of a net zero equation. What's that about?
Right, it's sort of the fundamental balancing act. Getting to net zero means the greenhouse gases we put in have to be balanced by what we take out.
Sources and sinks.
Exactly. Sources versus sinks, removals. And McKinsey's work identified 9 sort of core requirements needed to make this whole transition work. They group them into demand, supply, and enablers.
Okay. Demand, supply, enablers. Let's start with demand. What needs to change there?
Pretty intuitive, actually. Demand for the high-emission stuff has to go down. Think gasoline cars, fossil fuels themselves.
Okay. Less demand for the old stuff.
And at the same time, demand for the low-emission alternatives has to surge. EVs, renewable power, green hydrogen, sustainable materials.
Got it. So shift the demand. What about supply? How do we meet that new demand?
That's where we need a massive scale up on the supply side. More solar, more wind, developing things like hydrogen, sustainable biofuels.
Building it all out.
Yeah. And the report flags potential bottlenecks here too, like supply chains for critical minerals, copper, nickel, lithium. We need a lot more of them for batteries, wiring, turbines.
Right. Supply chain challenges. Okay, so demand shifts, supply scales up. What are the enablers? What makes it all happen?
The enablers are the background conditions, the support structures,
Huh?
things like effective government policy and regulation, carbon pricing, incentives,
Right.
standards,
Government action?
crucial. Also, continued technology innovation, making clean tech cheaper and better, and of course, finance, mobilizing all that capital we talked about.
Policy, tech, and money. The three legs of the stool.
You could put it that way, yeah. They all need to work together.
So with a shift this huge, there must be significant risks, but also big opportunities, right?
Absolutely, both sides of the coin. On the risk side, well, obviously the biggest risk is not transitioning fast enough and facing worse physical climate impact.
Yeah. Right, the cost of inaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the transition itself has risks if it's managed badly.
Yeah.
We mentioned labor market disruptions, asset stranding, and also the risk of a disorderly energy transition. Shutting down the old stuff too fast before the new stuff is fully ready. That could lead to energy shortages, price spikes, volatility.
Yeah, we've seen glimpses of that already. Serious challenges. But the opportunities, where's the upside?
The opportunities are massive for those who adapt and innovate. Countries, companies, decarbonizing existing products, making green steel, for example, creating totally new low-carbon solutions we haven't even thought of yet.
New industries.
Exactly. And providing all the supporting services and tech needed for this new economy. Think software for grid management, battery recycling, carbon accounting. Endless possibilities.
And the report mentions some countries might have natural advantages.
Yes, definitely. Countries with great solar or wind resources, big forests, the right geology for carbon storage, or deposits of those critical minerals. They could benefit significantly. And there's potential for developing countries, too, perhaps through things like carbon markets, selling offsets, if those markets develop properly.
So a potential rebalancing of economic advantage, maybe?
It's possible, yeah. The landscape could look quite different. Now, who needs to drive this? Who are the key actors?
It can't be just one group, surely.
No, it needs everyone pulling in the same direction, more or less. Governments and businesses, primarily.
What's the role for business?
Businesses need concrete decarbonization plans. Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, their direct operations and energy use. But increasingly, Scope 3, too, their supply chains, the use of their products.
That's the tricky one.
It is. They need to adapt business models, build climate risk into decisions, work with others in their sector.
And finance. You mentioned finance as an enabler.
Absolutely central. Financial institutions, banks, investors, insurers, they are critical for channeling the trillions needed and for managing the risks, pricing climate risk properly.
Steering the ship financially.
In many ways, yes. And governments. Set the rules of the road. Policy, regulation, using fiscal tools like taxes or subsidies, creating incentives, supporting vulnerable groups through the transition, fostering collaboration.
It really sounds like an all-hands-on-deck situation. Needs global cooperation.
It's inescapable. Climate change is global, the economy is global, the scale demands international collaboration on tech, on finance, on standards.
Yeah.
The report does end on a somewhat hopeful note, though. It stresses human ingenuity, our ability to solve big problems.
But with a caveat, right?
A big one. Decisive action this decade is critical. The choices we make now in the next few years will really set the path. We can't wait.
Okay. So, wrapping this up, this deep dive into the Mckinsey report. It paints a picture of a monumental task ahead. Huge costs, yes, but also massive opportunities.
And the fundamental driver underneath it all is avoiding the worst of climate change. That's the ultimate prize, or maybe the ultimate cost avoided.
It's going to reshape everything. Industries, jobs, how we live, how we consume.
Definitely. We've touched on the trillions in investment. The job shifts losses and gains the consumer impacts the stranded assets. It's complex, but the direction of travel seems clear.
So maybe the thought to leave you with is, how do these massive shifts affect your world? Your career, maybe your investments, your community?
Yeah, what role could innovation play? How adaptable are we, individually and collectively? Maybe think about which specific area we discussed really caught your attention. Is it the tech, the jobs, the finance?
There's definitely more to dig into.
Oh, for sure. The full report has much more detailed country specifics. It's a rich resource if you want to go deeper on any of this. But hopefully this gives you a solid handle on the big picture.